Ma'am, step away from that engine. You're not authorized here. Lieutenant Riker's sharp voice cut through the machinery space, slicing into the heavy air, thick with the smell of hot oil. Madison Hale didn't move. Her red coveralls were streaked with dust, and her calm eyes held no reaction, as if his words hadn't touched her at all. None of the watchstanders recognized the quiet woman before them. They only saw a stranger walking into the beating heart of the ship. Riker stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. Are you actually a technician, or did you just wander in here? The mocking tone drew a few snickers from the sailors behind him. Madison pulled out her work badge, clean, firm, unquestioning, but Riker barely glanced at it before brushing it aside like a joke. Fake badges are easy to print. And what is this? He pointed at the wrench wrapped in old leather inside her tool bag. Something you picked up from a junk shop? You plan on fixing a Navy turbine with a junk shop tool. Laughter rippled through the room, wave after wave. Madison still said nothing. Her fingers closed gently around the wrench, the very tool that had once saved an entire engineering team, but no one here knew that story. Riker stepped back half a pace, then barked, "Master at Arms, get this woman off the ship immediately. No one is to let her touch that engine." The room fell heavier. Eyes turned toward Madison, curious, doubtful, and tinged with a cruel sort of amusement. In that moment, she simply exhaled so softly that no one heard it. Then a deep rumble began to vibrate through the hull. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, steady, powerful, drawing closer with each passing second. Sailors lifted their heads. Riker blinked, his expression shifting from arrogant certainty to unsteady confusion. The ship's intercom crackled to life, each word echoing through steel. Attention on deck. Flag officer inbound. The entire machinery room froze. Madison Hale remained exactly where she stood, as if she had already known what was coming. If you believe true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the quiet strength of those who have walked through war, then subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories and help us preserve the dignity, the memories, and the honor of our nation's quiet heroes. Madison didn't respond to the whispers still lingering in the air. She simply stood there, quiet as a comma, in the middle of the machinery room's chaos. Her hand rested lightly on the old wrench inside her tool bag, just a small gesture, yet enough to anchor her to something familiar. Those around her had no idea what that tool meant, but to Madison, it was a fragment of memory she could never leave behind. The engine room pulsed softly with the rhythm of the auxiliary systems. Heat pressed down in layers, and the vents exhaled a steady stream of warm air, like the tired breath of a ship that had been motionless for 3 days. Amid the metallic hum and the constant vibration, Madison seemed to blend into the background. No reaction, no defensiveness, no anger. Only the silence of someone who had faced far harsher things than insults. Riker stepped forward, half a pace, impatience sharpening his voice. "I said it already, leave. Now." There was no reply. Madison kept her eyes on the cold turbine, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She touched the fuel line gently. Fingers moving slowly, guided by a familiarity etched into her from years of experience. A few sailors exchanged baffled looks, unsure why she was so calm. In that moment, a flash of memory cut through her mind. Back then, during a high-heat operation, in contested waters, the ship had been shaking relentlessly from heavy waves and the pressure of an enemy vessel shadowing them. Madison had only been a young technician. They encountered a failure in the cooling line positioned far too deep to reach with standard tools. No one had a solution. She saw a broken piece of metal fall from a bracket, saw the worn glove on the chief standing beside her, and without a word she fashioned a new tool right there on the deck. No one believed it would work, but it saved the engine and saved the ship. The memory passed quickly like a gust of scorching air. Madison returned to the present, where Riker was still giving orders, as if his voice alone could move her. But her stillness unsettled him more than any argument would have. Rather than react, she chose to stand firm, eyes fixed on the system they had failed to diagnose for 3 days. Her gaze didn't challenge it, understood. It carried the quiet certainty of someone who had listened to the heartbeat of engines across thousands of hours of watch. A young sailor, the same one who had laughed earlier, swallowed hard. He looked at Madison's face, then at the old wrench. Her silence was gaining its own gravity, the kind of weight only those who had lived long with machines and battlefield pressure could possess. No one said it aloud, but several of them were beginning to realize this woman was nothing like the temporary technicians they had met before. Riker repeated his order, but this time his voice had lost its edge. "You don't belong here." Madison turned her head slightly. Her look wasn't confrontational, more like she was silently asking whether he truly understood what he was trying to protect. She didn't speak yet. That single gesture caused Riker's confidence to stumble. He had seen anger. He had seen fear. But Madison's kind of calmness, it made him feel as if he were the one intruding, not her. The atmosphere in the machinery room shifted. The mocking smiles disappeared. Sailors started watching Madison more closely. Every slow movement, every time she touched the turbine, as though reading a story carved deep into its metal. She didn't need to explain herself. Her silence did it for her. Riker drew a deep breath, trying desperately to reclaim control. But even if he hadn't realized it yet, the board had already begun to shift. And Madison's quiet, unwavering composure was the needle that had just pierced the first layer of his arrogance. And as that silence stretched on for a few more heartbeats, the people in the engine room began to wonder whether they had completely misjudged the woman standing before them. Just moments away from a revelation none of them could have imagined. Riker made no effort to hide his irritation. He stepped forward and raised his voice loud enough for the entire engine room to hear, "You are not touching my turbine!" The final words struck the steel bulkheads like a hammer, forcing every pair of eyes to snap toward Madison as if she had violated some sacred rule of the ship. Riker turned to the watch team. "Get 2 more master-at-arms down here. I want her out of this space immediately." A sailor answered, "Yes, sir," and hurried off while a few others allowed themselves faint smirks, the kind of smiles people wear when they think they stand safely beside authority. "She's just some rookie wrench-turner," someone whispered behind her, not loud enough to be reprimanded, but loud enough to wound. Another voice followed. "Look at her tool bag. Says everything." Waves of mocking murmurs moved across the room. Eyes skimmed over Madison with careless judgment. Eyes that believed they knew everything simply because they had worn a uniform for years. Then Riker suddenly bent down, reached into her tool bag, and pulled out the old wrench wrapped in leather. He lifted it like evidence of a crime. This belongs in a scrap heap. This thing belongs in a scrap heap." Laughter cracked through the engine room, quick, sharp, lacking any trace of humanity. Madison stared at the wrench. Not as a tool, but as the memory of a man now gone. For a heartbeat, the laughter faded in her mind, replaced by the ragged breaths of a mission show from years before, the screech of metal, the salt of seawater mixing with burning heat, and the frantic fear that the engine might explode at any moment. Back then, Chief Alvarez had held the glowing hot piece of metal steady so she could shape it into a makeshift tool. His hands blistered. He never complained, and because of that tool, they stopped the failure in time. The next day, Alvarez was killed on another operation. That wrench was the last piece of him Madison had left. The laughter snapped her back to the present. Riker still held the wrench, twisting it between his fingers like some worthless trinket. Madison reached out her hand, gentle but unyielding. "Give it back to me." Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't sharp, but it halted Riker for a beat. "What did you say?" Madison looked directly at him. "This tool saved someone's life. Don't handle it like trash." The engine room went silent. It was the first time she had pushed back. There was no anger in her tone, no wounded pride, only truth spoken by someone who had paid dearly to understand it. Riker's brow tightened. "You don't have the right to take that tone here." Madison didn't argue. She simply held her silence, a silence that made Riker's harsh words fall to the steel deck like a loose bearing rolling into emptiness. A few sailors shifted uneasily. The humiliation they thought belonged to her was beginning to drift toward the young officer who had tried so hard to assert himself by diminishing another person. Then at the far end of the passageway, a figure stopped. A familiar silhouette of shipboard life, broad shoulders, close-cropped silver hair, eyes worn by experience. Chief Dalton stood motionless, saying nothing. He took in the scene before him, then looked at the wrench in Riker's hand. His expression froze as if he had just recognized a name he had heard countless times in long conversations among senior chiefs, the name he never expected to meet here, Madison Hale. His silence thickened the entire room as though something much larger was beginning to rise beneath the steel shell of the ship. And in the moment, Dalton took one deliberate step into the engine room. A new current began to move, ready to pull authority out of Riker's grasp and place it into the hands of a truth none of them had seen coming. Chief Dalton stood at the narrow passageway leading into the engine room, his eyes still locked onto the name Madison Hale as it slowly resurfaced in his memory. He stepped back, pulled out his duty phone, and without hesitation, without needing to consult anyone, dialed directly to the Fleet Master Chief, a rank most sailors would never speak to in their entire careers. "Sir." Dalton lowered his voice as if revealing something no one else should overhear. We've got Madison Hale down here. The Madison Hale. There was half a beat of silence on the other end, the kind of silence that only appears when the information received reaches far beyond expectations. Then the Fleet Master Chief's voice hardened. Confirm the name. Dalton answered immediately. Hale. Madison Hale. A young lieutenant is trying to revoke her access. A brief pause. I'll send this straight to Flag. And the call ended. The chain of authority began to move. From the bottom of the ship, the information climbed through each level of command, like a line of ignition firing upward. Within minutes, it reached Admiral Rowan, who was in the middle of a virtual meeting with 2 senior officers regarding maintenance readiness in the training sector. His aide rushed in and leaned close, whispering a few words into his ear. Rowan stopped the speaker mid-sentence. Hold on a moment. He turned to his second screen. Pull up Madison Hale's record. The file appeared instantly. Achievements stacked one after another. A list of commendations so long it seemed unbelievable for a technician. A highlighted entry. Extraordinary action during Operation Starlance saved engine number 3 under inaccessible conditions. And a note from the commanding officer of that year, without her the ship would have been lost and hundreds would not have returned. Rowan stared at that line. Then he stood up. Prep my bird. I'm wheels up in 5. No one questioned it. No one dared. He turned back to the main screen and spoke a single sentence before leaving the room. If the person obstructing her is one of our officers, then that officer needs to be reminded what it means to serve. Meanwhile, back in the engine room, Riker stood at the watch desk holding the temporary order to revoke Madison Hale's access to the turbine compartment. His expression was calm to the point of arrogance. He signed it quickly, as if dealing with a trivial administrative matter. This is an official order, he announced to the watchstanders, trying to maintain authority in his voice. She'll be escorted topside to verify her credentials. No one responded. The silence thickened heavy as the steel surrounding the compartment. One sailor glanced at Madison, then back at Riker. In his eyes was a hesitation that hadn't been there moments earlier. Another sailor stepped half a pace backward, as though he no longer wanted to stand on Riker's side. The mood of the engine room shifted. The nervous laughter from earlier had vanished completely. People began to wonder if a woman could remain so calm holding on to an old, worn tool, like it was a treasure, facing humiliation, without a single tremor. Was it possible they had judged everything wrong? Then the sound arrived, distant at first, then growing stronger. The helicopter's rotor beat struck the hull in steady, heavy rhythms. No one spoke, but everyone understood this wasn't the vibration of a routine visit. A sailor whispered, "A flag officer." Really? No one answered, but their faces changed, doubt turning into the realization that what was happening was far bigger than any of them had imagined. And as the rotor thunder grew stronger and stronger, the fate of that engine room quietly shifted, preparing to unfold a moment Riker could never have foreseen. The rotor beat still trembled faintly through the ship's steel frame when Admiral Rowan appeared at the threshold of the engine room. The smell of hot oil, the hiss of ventilation, and the lingering tension from the confrontation moments earlier seemed to part to either side, making way for the man who carried more than 3 decades of experience at sea. As he descended the steps, each measured footfall made nearby sailors instinctively straighten their bodies, remembering protocol, even before their minds caught up. Rowan didn't look at Riker. He didn't look at any of the sailors holding their breath, unsure of what was about to happen. His gaze went straight to Madison Hale, the woman standing quietly holding the old wrench with an unmistakable reverence. "Chief Hale, it's been too long." The air tightened for a long moment. A few sailors furrowed their brows, unable to believe what they'd heard. "Chief." The woman they had just mocked, the one they assumed was a novice, Madison only gave a slight nod. "Admiral." A simple greeting, yet enough for the entire engine room to understand these two had once shared a battlefield none of them had known existed. Footsteps echoed as the entire watch team snapped to attention. Some were awkward, unsure, but none dared remain casual. Riker also stood rigid, frozen in place, his eyes widening when he heard the Admiral address Madison by rank. Rowan glanced briefly at him and spoke, his voice low but heavy as a verdict. "You almost expelled the woman who saved my ship." Each word fell like steel dust, settling in the lungs, dense, cold, unforgettable. A ripple traveled down the line of sailors. Every gaze turned toward Madison, not with doubt now, nor derision, but with awe and disbelief. Rowan continued, turning to the group. "Do you know Operation Starlance? That year, my ship was deceived by false pressure readings, and we lost control of Engine 3. If that engine had fully failed, we would have become a sitting target in monitored waters." He placed a hand on the metal beside him, eyes drifting back into the desperate hours of that mission. No one had a solution. No one except her. He pointed to the wrench in Madison's hand. She crafted a new tool out of a broken piece of metal when all of us thought it was over. A chief held the fragment for her until his hands blistered. And because of her solution, the ship survived. We survived. Silence spread again, but this time it carried reverence rather than discomfort. Someone swallowed hard. Someone else bowed their head. Those who had laughed earlier felt a weight settle heavily in their chests. Riker tried to speak, but no words came. Rowan looked at him not with anger, but with the cold disappointment of someone who had watched too many young officers forget that a uniform was not a badge for the ego. You didn't see experience. You didn't see truth. You saw a red coverall and the label civilian. He spoke slowly, ensuring every person in the room heard him clearly. In the Navy, we are not permitted to make mistakes like that. Then he turned back to Madison. Let her work. No one interferes. No one argued. No one dared. The sentence became a command, not only about duty, but about respect for someone who had once stood on the edge of life and death to keep a ship from sinking into silence. Madison looked around, not to challenge anyone, but to confirm the room had finally settled into its rightful order. The eyes fixed on her were different now. They no longer saw an intruder, but the one person who truly understood what lay beneath the layers of steel powering the ship. And just as Rowan stepped aside to give her access to the turbine, the weight of truth spread across the space, clearing the way for the moment when the entire ship would finally witness her real mastery. Without waiting for another order, Madison stepped toward the turbine that had kept the entire ship dead in the water for 3 days. She set her tool bag down, opened it, and pulled out one of the simplest instruments the Navy often overlooked. In an age of advanced machinery, a mechanical stethoscope. Not an electronic device, not a diagnostic sensor. Just the kind of tool early generation technicians had treated like a second pair of hands. You're going to use that to find the problem, a sailor blurted out. Madison didn't answer. She simply placed the stethoscope's tip against the turbine's casing, tilted her head, and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Her hand moved inch by inch along the fuel line, touching bolts, tracing connections, until it stopped near the third injector assembly. A pause stretched over the room like a taut wire. The watchers waited for the familiar beeps of modern diagnostic systems, but Madison relied only on the sound. Her ears had heard thousands of times under pressure, in storm-tossed seas, in the moments when everyone feared the ship was taking its last breath. She opened her eyes. Here. 3 sailors stepped forward, where Ma'am Madison pressed 2 fingers onto a connection deep within the fuel atomizer unit. There's a crack, very small, but enough to corrupt the mixture. The computer doesn't detect it because it only sees data. It doesn't hear the engine breathe. She removed the assembly using the same old wrench. Her movements were clean, precise, almost effortless. The group fell into absolute silence. Once the component came free, Madison held it up for the chief engineer to see. Here, she said. A thin fracture, fine as a strand of hair, nearly invisible to the naked eye. No one understood how she had found it so quickly. But to Madison, a turbine's irregular sound was like the faint gasp of a longtime friend. You only had to listen to know. She did more than repair. She taught. At this point, she said, if you rely only on the screen, you'll miss it. And here you have to use your senses. Machines read data. You read its life. Each word transformed the younger sailors, those who had mocked her earlier, into quiet students standing before a master. Once the replacement part was installed, the chief engineer spoke. Madison. May I? She nodded. Start it. But let the RPM rise slowly. The engine rumbled awake. At first a low growl, then stronger. Readout stabilized. No warnings. Within seconds, the entire ship shuddered as though it had been brought back from a long, exhausted sleep. 10,000 horsepower surged into the machinery space, running along the keel like a restored promise. A small cheer escaped. Then a breath of relief. Then the look in their eyes changed completely. Madison remained still, composed, as if she had simply tidied up a familiar workbench. Riker watched the scene unfold, his face paling. His initial confusion shifted into dread. As he realized that the issue his entire engineering team had failed to diagnose for 3 days, she had deciphered in minutes. His gaze dropped to the leather-wrapped wrench. The tool he had called scrap was in truth the instrument of a legend. Chief Dalton stepped forward half a pace. She just saved us from losing the mission, he said quietly, but loudly enough for Riker to hear. Riker couldn't speak. He could only look at Madison for the first time with the eyes of a man who understood He had been standing on the wrong side from the beginning. And as the turbine reached stable RPM, everyone knew Madison had revived not only the ship, but the respect that had been lost in the engine room, setting the stage for the deepest lesson awaiting those who remained. When the engine had stabilized and the crew began to disperse with a relief they hadn't felt in 3 days, Riker remained in a corner of the machinery room. His shoulders had dropped and the arrogance had drained completely from his face. He looked at his own hands, then at Madison, the woman he had treated as an intruder just hours before. Amid the steady roar of the revived turbine, he walked toward her. "Madison." His voice was low now, nothing like the sharp tone from before. I was wrong. Not just a little wrong. Wrong in how I looked at things, how I thought, how I treated you. He inhaled deeply, as if swallowing the last remnants of his pride. "I'm truly sorry." Madison lifted her gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, no desire to make him feel smaller. Only the calm that belonged to someone who had walked away from battlefields. She answered softly, so softly, it was almost a whisper. "Don't be sorry. Be better." Riker blinked. He hadn't expected such a simple response, and yet it struck him deeper than any reprimand could. Before he could speak again, Madison continued. "Expertise doesn't always wear the uniform you expect. Experience isn't stitched on the chest or pinned on the shoulder. It lives in burned hands, in engines repaired under fire, and sleepless nights spent keeping a ship alive." Riker bowed his head, not because of rank, but because truth had finally found him. Madison placed her hand on the metal rail beside the turbine, her eyes drifting toward the young sailors lingering in the distance. "Listen to your chiefs. They've lived what you only read. They paid for every lesson. Don't ignore that legacy." Riker swallowed hard. He looked around at the older chiefs, the faces marked by years and hardship. He realized he had spoken too much and listened too little. And it was Madison's silence, not her words, that had taught him what no training course ever had. "Thank you," he said slowly. Madison simply nodded. No blame. No boasting. No grand lecture. Just the quiet dignity of someone who understood what service truly meant. A week later, the story had spread across the unit. No one recounted it with triumph, and no one embellished the details. Only one message was repeated over and over: humility saves more than any machine ever will. After reviewing Admiral Rowan's report, fleet leadership issued an unprecedented change: mandatory integration of civilian specialists into high-level technical watches. New training on evaluating expertise based on capability, not uniform. And most importantly, mechanisms to ensure voices like Madison's would be heard before a failure became a crisis. The young sailors on that ship would never forget the experience. Not because the engine had been resurrected, but because something stronger than 10,000 horsepower had moved that day, the growth of a person who learned to face his mistakes. And as the ship departed on its next deployment, those changes began to ripple outward, like waves across the water, preparing for the final chapter, where Madison's quiet legacy would be written into the entire fleet. A week after the turbine incident, Navy leadership officially released a new technical update. At the top of the document, young sailors saw a name they had never heard before, but now knew by heart: the HALE protocol, a gas turbine diagnostic procedure based on sensing vibrations, shifts in tonal resonance, and hotspot detection through manual methods combined with battlefield experience. In the following training sessions, young engineers stepped onto the podium with a newfound confidence. They no longer relied solely on digital displays. They learned to listen to the heartbeat of the engine the way Madison once had. Every movement was passed down with a quiet respect for the woman who had pioneered it. And gradually, during the exchanges between watch teams, people began referring to HALE as the new gold standard. When the day came for Madison to leave the ship, there was no ceremony, no speeches, no shouted commands. Only the wide-open deck and 2 rows of sailors standing at attention. Their shoulders squared, their eyes forward, fixed on the woman who had taught them a lesson deeper than any technical manual. Madison walked slowly, her work boots tapping the familiar steel she had stepped on aboard countless ships. No one spoke. That silence was the most beautiful tribute she could have received. Chief Dalton approached. In his hands was the old wrench, now cleaned of oil, its leather wrap carefully restored. He placed it into Madison's hand. "Your legend lives on." It wasn't a grand statement. It wasn't exaggerated praise. It was simply the truth: her legacy had reached far beyond the engine room of that day. Madison pressed her lips together, touching the wrench's handle, as though touching the memories of those who came before her. That wrench had once saved a ship. It had embodied the sacrifice of a chief who never returned. And now it had become a symbol for an entire generation of technicians those who understood that sometimes the simplest tools carried the deepest wisdom. A breeze drifted across the deck, stirring the red coveralls Madison wore. That red stood out against the gray steel, a stroke of color, marking her resolve, her years of endurance in the hum of machinery, and her victories that never needed to be recorded to endure. Sailors watched her walk, imprinting the image quietly into their minds, that extraordinary people sometimes didn't wear uniforms, yet still belonged to the Navy family in the truest sense. As Madison descended the gangway, she heard the faint murmurs of young sailors behind her. Not the mocking laughter from the first day, not the doubt. But stories about her and how she touched the turbine as though touching an old friend. Stories passed along not with embellishment, but with reverence. From that day forward, whenever they faced a difficult failure, they would remember her. Whenever they encountered a technician whose hands were scarred and worn, they would recall her words. Expertise doesn't always wear the uniform you expect. And so, in the quietest way, Madison Hale stepped off the ship, carrying with her a legacy that required no orders and no medals, a legacy living in the eyes of everyone she met, and in the new procedures the fleet would continue to use for many years to come. If this story reminds you that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Veterans Legacy Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,